Okay. All right. Well, for the sake of your time, we'll go ahead and get started. Very small class today. Wow. You three have to speak a lot. You got to carry the weight. And Heidi, you too. You gotta participate. So, no, I am videoing this. So for those who aren't here, you can catch it online. But okay. Well, with that being said, I think what we'll do, just a little quick overview of the class today. So I think today first we'll go over the lecture topic, the transition from warrior to diplomat. And then the second session will go through the case, the essays that you wrote and the Buses for Democracy case. And then in the third session we'll have Heidi speak. And again, the goal is to get out of here a little bit early. So hopefully, with even with a small class, we should be able to do that today. So first, I'll bring up our good friends on the video. I hope this doesn't come through too loud. Let's see. There we go.
Good afternoon and welcome to the 6th in our 7-part series on the seismic shifts necessary for people to move up to the role of enterprise leader. I'm joined today to look at the 6th of 7 seismic shifts with Professor MAQ00337. Michael, thank you for being back with us today.
Good to be back, Paul.
Today's an interesting one. You talk about the shift from warrior to diplomat, both of which I guess are fairly emotionally laden terms, warrior and diplomat. Tell us about that shift. Are you saying that if you're not a natural diplomat or you're not naturally good at diplomatic skills, you can't be an enterprise leader?
I think that's true. I think that unless you're capable of doing a certain amount of what I think of as diplomacy, which basically means managing networks of relationships, building the right kinds of alliances, shaping the external environment, I think you're going to have a really rough go as an enterprise leader. And this can be a very challenging shift for some. One example I use is a very accomplished leader in a global healthcare company that I did some work with. And, you know, she had done a tremendous job of being a really good operational leader and been promoted on that basis to the point where she was leading a major sector of the business. And I met with her not long after that happened, and she said to me, you know, she said, Michael, I'm struggling. She said, I'm being asked to, you know, meet with the media a lot and, you know, go to Washington and, you know, talk to regulators and stuff. And she says, and I hate it. She says, it doesn't feel like it creates any value to me, right? And I just don't like doing it at all. And I'm kind of going, oh boy, right? Because this is a core part of the responsibilities at that level. She says, but I know I need to do it, right? Okay. And I think it's that sort of thing, is that sometimes, you know, what you have as your experience inside the business doesn't prepare you for your responsibility as being the prime person connecting with the external environment, whether it's with the media or with analysts or with government, NGOs, the whole panoply of external players. And you've got to be engaging in a form of diplomacy. And sometimes that's cooperating with people that you're otherwise out doing battle with every day, right? So trade associations are often places where competing companies are legally and legitimately working together to try and shape the regulatory structure of industries, for example, right? And if you bring your warrior ethos into those meetings, you're probably not doing your company a good service.
So if you're not into politics, keep away from enterprise leadership.
I would say embrace politics with a small p, and get over any, you know, squeamishness or sense that it's not legitimate, because it's a part of the way the world works. And if you're not prepared to embrace it to a degree while maintaining your values, then I think you're going to really struggle as an enterprise leader. I don't think there's any way of avoiding it fundamentally, right? The world, when you start dealing at the level of the external environment of businesses, is inherently a political place. Likewise, frankly, the diplomacy that's required at the senior executive levels. You know, I teach MBAs sometimes, as you know, and it comes as a big shock to them that politics becomes more intense as you go up through organizations. Many of them believe that somehow, crystalline rationality will sort of emerge at the top of organizations, and that's just not true, right? Because you've got people with very strong egos that are out trying to get things done. The agendas are not as clear. There's more ambiguity. There's not necessarily right answers, and so politics is an inherent part of how things get done. And if you're not prepared to play the game, you're not going to succeed.
So less fighting and more smiling.
Well, so fighting and smiling are both important, right? You want to be continuing to hone the competitiveness of your business, right? And you want to feed the fire of the people inside the business that are out there, meeting the competition in the marketplace every day. But yes, the smile, right? The willingness. If by smiling you mean the willingness to build relationships, if by smiling you mean the ability to understand what is it that you really need and how do our interests align. If by smiling you mean let's create an alliance to pursue some things that we have as shared interests, absolutely. But I think that the core piece is really understanding some of the underlying, drivers and technology basically that needs to sort of sit under this.
When we think of this in terms of a shift, so you talk about moving from warrior to diplomat, does that mean you need to have been a warrior? Do you need to have that iron fist within the velvet glove to take on enterprise leadership? You've told us about the need for diplomacy, but do you need that instinctive, competitive, fighting spirit to be an enterprise leader?
So I think there are very few people who get to senior executive positions without a strong competitive spirit, right? I think it's almost inherent to get to the top of organizations that you've got to have some drive. And that drive is also either a competitive drive with regard to others, or it's a self-competitive drive to want to achieve things, but it's there, right? And if it's not there, typically you're not going to end up being a senior executive. The thing you have to be careful about is, does that at some point begin to get in your way, right? Is the reflex to compete something that's really not serving you well in certain circumstances, right? Do you need to learn to curb that, to be aware of when you're kind of overdoing it a little bit, right? And that's where I see people go wrong, Paul. It is not by being competitive. It's by being competitive in the wrong circumstances and not understanding that there's a balance between collaboration and competition that needs to be achieved.
Now, we talked last week when we talked about the agenda setter, the importance to strike a good balance between the external environment and the internal environment, and you hinted at that probably as you move up an organization, the external part kind of becomes more important. How can diplomats learn to shape their external environment?
So first of all, the observation you just made is absolutely correct, right? That as you move to those top positions, you now are the person that's got to be out there at least shaping, the approach that the organization is going to use to dealing with government, dealing with the media. And typically, by the way, also you're going to be working with people in functions that you may not have a whole lot of previous experience with, right? So suddenly the communications staff, the legal staff, right? The government relations staff, the analyst relations staff. All of a sudden those corporate functions become a core part of what you need to create, shape, and lead to leverage yourself in doing this. So absolutely, that focus on the external environment becomes more intense, and that's really at the core of the shift that needs to happen. Your orientation more externally, your orientation more to understanding the complex political relationships that are happening, and really learning to shape those as opposed to react to them.
So do joint ventures, do mergers and acquisitions, do they fall into this category?
Absolutely, right? So I think any time that you're engaged in trying to do institution-to-institution work, right? Whether it's forming a JV to accomplish some limited task, or deciding you're going to acquire a company, it's absolutely part of the diplomatic work you're doing, because part of it's going to be overseeing the negotiation that leads to that successful large acquisition. But it's also going to be understanding how government regulators are going to react, right? What are the antitrust concerns going to be in different environments, in different regions? How are you going to prepare yourself to deal with all that piece? What about employees, right? And how that reaction is going to happen? How are you going to manage the integration process, right? To achieve some unity of structure, purpose, culture when it's all over. Those all, to me, fall into this diplomatic piece.
So people might be watching today and say, wow, you know, you've got to deal with governments, you've got to deal with government organizations, you've got to deal with NGOs. That's, you know, just not possible for one person to manage all of that. That, you know, he or she's going to have some kind of team around them to make that happen. Again, as an enterprise leader coming into that kind of situation, how do you know to what extent you kind of get your hands on, and where do you need to pull back?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of gaining experience over time. You know, I think that in general, most people taking those roles for the first time underestimate the amount of time they need to spend on that, because they don't really understand the profound impact that things like government or the media can have necessarily on the business. And it's kind of a growing awareness, right, that that's important. But if you look at some of the great CEOs of the world, they spend a lot of time doing this. I mean, one example I would give you is Fred Smith at FedEx, right? You know, Mr. Smith spends a lot of time in Washington, D.C. and in other major capitals engaging in discussions with government, participating in many different forums. He's been a leader in thinking about sustainability issues for a long time, right? He understood from the beginning that that piece of it was crucial, right? FedEx would not have been created if he had not led an effort to change air freight regulation in the United States, right? They'd still be flying small planes because they weren't allowed to. So understanding that your business is inextricably linked with that external environment, and that you can either play somebody else's game or you can shape it.
So these diplomatic skills that are necessary, we can see lots of very positive and necessary reasons to have those, but I guess those can be used in a negative way as well. We hear and we look at some of the corporate disasters that we've seen recently. We can, you know, see stories of CEOs charming their board, getting people on board, avoiding, you know, choosing the people who are on the board, avoiding those tough questions. Again, how do you walk that fine line between, yeah, I need to be diplomatic to get what I'm doing, but I also need to be challenged. I also need to sometimes be exposed to the tough issues.
So I think, you know, we could have a long conversation about this, Paul, but I think that I view diplomacy as a technology, right? There's a set of ideas and approaches, you know, to building alliances, for example, right? I'm going to build an alliance with you first, and I'm going to use that alliance to then accomplish another goal and build another one. There's technique here, right? Influence technique, you know, alliance building technique. But like any technology, right, it's the underpinning uses that it's put to that are crucial. And in business, those are really, you know, defined at the senior leadership levels by two things, right? The values that the leaders bring to the table and the governance structures in which they operate. And if you have weaknesses in either of those things, you're going to start to see the problems that we've seen emerge. And those problems typically emerge because you have leaders who are pursuing their own agendas for the wrong reasons, right? For example, pursuing major acquisitions because it's going to put a cap on their careers, whether it really makes sense or not. Right? Or you see problems with governments, right? Not enough independence on the part of boards to kind of constrain and make the right balance happen. But you can't avoid politics, and you want to be good at it, right? But you want to be doing it in the ways that serve the right purposes.
Michael, thank you. The sixth in our 7 seismic shifts, moving from warrior to diplomat. Thank you very much for being with us again today.
Okay. Okay. So, when you guys hear the word diplomat or diplomacy, what do you guys think? That was something I asked myself when I was first developing this course and got onto this this shift. It's an interesting one. It's not, you know, typically in the business context. So, you know, here's a couple words associated. But for you guys, what did you think of, Julian, when you thought of diplomat or diplomacy? What do you think?
Influence.
Mm-hmm.
Relationships.
Mm-hmm. Does it have a good connotation or a negative one?
Good. I mean, a lot of things get done through relationships and, you know, the influence that you have. And I think diplomacy is, at least in my limited understanding of it, diplomacy is a lot of relationships and how you balance those relationships. I like that guy said, how you manage your external environment for your situation.
Yeah. Jeff, what about you?
First thing that popped in my mind was like foreign affairs, like external to the U.S. type of diplomacy, and it didn't really have a good connotation in my mind. I was like, it just seemed like very political to the point where it was just kind of a death spiral, not actually getting anything done. So that was kind of my thought as I read it. But I think the case helped me a lot to better understand like what does it actually look like, and it kind of helped me come to a different conclusion than I originally started with.
Okay, good. Alex?
With diplomats, I think about someone that works to come to an agreement with someone in the least abrasive manner. So like that's, I guess, how diplomacy, that's political, I guess.
Yeah.
Just someone that works to broker a deal in the nicest way possible.
Yep. Well, I mean, you can see, these big words: international, public, theoretical, institutions, foreign, debates, power. I think that's what a lot of us think of when they think of diplomat or diplomacy. And in fact, I'll show you the Webster's definition in just a minute. It fits that. But of course, what we're talking about, really more in the business context is more sort of this sort of stuff. Negotiations, management, trade, union, rules, economics, agreements, incentives, that type of stuff. And so I thought this was an interesting shift because I think Professor Watkins was, referring to the fact that at the real high level, especially at the top of these global companies, the CEO probably spends more time on this type of work than virtually, anything else. And it's with, government relations, it's with the media, it's with shareholders. In some ways, a CEO job is chief ambassador, chief diplomat, chief negotiator. For those of us that aren't really at that level, it's I think the point he was making that we underestimate it, and I think Heidi, you can probably comment about she's talking to high-level government officials. She's been in the Oval Office standing next to the president and talking to the president. I mean, this is a full-time job for many people. Would you agree?
It sure is, and I think again, what I like about this slide here is that it brings in so many business dimensions. So again, I think we think of diplomacy as very external facing, but there are a lot of core business issues. I see the word union. I mean, for companies that have a union workforce, there are labor negotiations. You want to have a good relationship with the labor leader. And so that you may not associate that as much through about Washington, D.C. or your state capital, but that requires diplomacy. And yeah, the CEOs are spending a lot of time on issues like that as well as the whole range.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is if you look in Webster's dictionary, this is the first definition: the art and practice of conducting negotiations between nations. So that's probably what we all, thought of. And that's correct, but also, this is what Alex was just saying: skill in handling affairs without arousing hostility. That's really the business part of it, right? It's finding common solutions and discussing delicate subjects in a way in which you further and promote a solution rather than get people upset and angry and drive them away. So from our perspective, in our context here in this class, and I think Professor Watkins said this, diplomacy is managing networks and relationships, building networks, and shaping the external environment. That's what a lot of us do in our businesses every day. That's what leaders in trade associations, leaders in government, leaders in large business and small business. It's really, you can break it down on this low level. Managing networks and relationships, shaping the external environment, being an advocate, that's what it's all about. And I would agree that you develop a better appreciation for it the more time you spend with it. I can just briefly talk about my relationship with the Aluminum Association. Our company has been a member of this trade association for many, many, many years. I was not heavily involved. We had a different person in our group really as our main contact and sat on the board and a few other things, and then I got involved, and admittedly I probably got involved kind of on the lower level. I got involved in the statistics program, which was really helpful and interesting, and started to gain my appreciation. Heidi and her staff brought me into some other things. Ironically, there's been some issues going on in our industry which have put even an extra emphasis on participation and having a voice and being in Washington, D.C. more frequently. And as I've spent more and more time doing it, I can really see that the value is there. If you had grabbed me 4 years ago and said, hey, do you really get value? I would have said, well, we all get together and we're advocates and we exchange opinions, but there was nothing that really crystallized it for me. But now that we are in a situation, which we'll talk about later, where decisions are being made by our government, which are moving millions of dollars around between countries and between suppliers and between customers, and this is where you really see how this is worth spending a lot of time on. So we'll get into that a bit later. So you can imagine in your role as diplomat, you have to deal with a lot of stakeholders. You have to deal with unions, as we discussed. You have to deal with competitors, suppliers, banks. My gosh, small business owners, you probably know a lot about dealing with banks, investors, the media, NGOs, regulators. It is a lot, and to the point made in the video, I mean, you really do need a staff. You need a staff of really good people in order to manage a lot of this. But what I like to do is I think about, okay, again, what's the opposite of being a diplomat? It's in their context, being a warrior. If you're in warrior mode, you have a very different outlook when you're dealing with your competitors. You have, in a way, a very different outlook when you're with your competitors, because it's always a negotiation. You're trying to get as much value out of them. They're trying to get as much value out of you. You're kind of in a warrior mode. If you're not acting like a diplomat, you need to be really careful with unions. Unions will use tools to get an advantage. I mean, a strike is really nothing more than a tool in order to get a better negotiated settlement. So the whole point of being a diplomat is that, you have to have the big picture, see the forest through the trees. And when you're lower in the organization, when you're young in your career, you tend to be in that warrior mode. And in fact, but that's not a bad thing, right? You're being asked to be in that warrior mode. Your organization, your business unit, you need people who are out there fighting for the best interest of your department or your company. But when you get up to that enterprise leader role, things start to shift. So, a couple questions that we're posing in this section. What are the challenges of dealing effectively with various stakeholders and outside constituencies? This gets a little bit into the topic from last week, becoming an integrator, going from analyst to integrator. But you guys all have some work experience. What can you say? What are some of the challenges dealing with different, groups that are, either truly external to you, or at least even within your company, maybe in a different department or in a different division? You've all been through it. What are some?
Understand the long-term implications of their actions or whatever changes you're trying to implement, and how that it might be challenging this week, but 2 months from now it'll be well worth it and make their life easier. But
and why is the big picture so hard to see sometimes?
Because they like doing what they've been doing for the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's a lot of that. Yeah. Or could it be that, not everyone has a broad perspective, that, they're very well versed in their role or their job or their company or their industry or their market, but they don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I think that too. I mean, as an example, we had an account that used trailers that you had done on with a crane, and so we basically had to have a guy that just ran a crane all day, and with using the crane, material handle the crane all the time, you break a lot of hoses, and the hoses are high pressure hoses are expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So we invested in some different equipment, and the crane operator didn't really like it. The yard foreman didn't really like it.
Mm-hmm.
But like 3 weeks later, they were both happy as could be because the other guy wasn't getting pulled off of doing what he had been doing.
Yeah.
And the other guy wasn't having to fix hoses all the time. So,
That's a good example.
getting people to understand that there's long-term happiness in the short-term change.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, another piece of it is, or some situations are slightly different where you have to like look past of the immediate issue
Mm-hmm.
in order to see that, because a lot of times groups they'll sit here and they'll fight over this relatively small things, even if more long-term they can more easily get aligned on some of those big picture things that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of making the cognitive decision to set aside whatever the argument of the day or the week is. I see this a lot. I work a lot with people who dispute transactions
Okay.
versus the true fraud. And these two teams are always butting heads because like, no, it's actually fraud. It's not a dispute, or like things like that. And it's just like, guys, it doesn't matter because at the end of the day, the customer's frustrated and said he didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't matter if like by the terms and agreements of this credit card, what's actually behind the scenes, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And they can all agree on big picture things, but they sit here and they throw these transactions back and forth. And so just kind of to align on the long term so that we can kind of ignore the nuance thing that doesn't really matter.
Sure. Yeah, and at some point, somebody in your organization has to say, is this dispute creating value, or is it wasting a lot of time and energy and diverting attention away from, I know Capital One pretty well. You guys put a high focus on customer satisfaction. And I can imagine that, this doesn't help that.
Yeah. Like in this scenario, no matter what, the transaction is going to get written off. Like, I understand it matters like whose P&L it comes from.
Right.
But to the largest degree, it doesn't matter because the company as a whole is going to write it off anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you guys would be shocked that, or you wouldn't be shocked, maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't, that within a big company, every day you have these types of silly disputes. One of our guys got invited to go speak at a conference in Australia. And so we got asked, would you let this guy go? It's basically going to take 2 weeks. By the time you get there, and the travel and the adjustment and being at the conference for 3 days, he's out for 2 weeks. And so they said, hey, would you lend him to us? And we said, yes. And then, of course, this guy said, well, I'll go only if they'll pay for my flight because he has a travel budget. And, a flight to Australia is expensive. And so, and they sort of said, oh, well, we don't really do that. I mean, it's all left pocket, right pocket. And he, this guy was just adamant, I'm not going unless you pay for. And so then at a certain point, I just said, okay, fine, put on my budget. This is ridiculous. Why are we wasting time on this? It's $6,000. But, people don't see the forest through the trees. So, nope, good reflections. How do you get everybody on the same page? I mean, that's always the challenge, right? I mean, and that's what we talked about last week, being an integrator. I mean, how do you influence people? And it's different, right? Some people are fact-driven. Give me the data. Give me the facts. Prove it to me. Let me see the business case. Other people are emotionally driven. Tell me the story. Move me emotionally so that I buy into, what you're saying. I mean, you have to know. As a diplomat, you have to know who's my audience. I can tell you, if you're talking with Japanese or Germans, they're very fact-based. They're very data-driven. They're very, empirical data. You talk to Brazilians and Italians, it's, tell me the story. I mean, it's emotional. It's, tell me, they'll tell you about their kids and their family. I mean, you have to know your audience too. So that's, again, some of these soft skills that we've talked about. Yeah, and same thing. How do you influence them? I mean, is there something to be said about being a charming person? Is that helpful as a diplomat? Just being a likable person, being a charming person? I would say absolutely. Sure. I mean, if the person representing, let's say you're in a negotiation and the other person across the table comes across as abrasive or not very friendly, I mean, you get into that mode. Okay, I'm going to sort of fight power with power. If the person is very open and warm and friendly and gracious, your brain, you transition into that too. So I would argue that any good diplomat has a certain level of charm to them. You have to be tough at times, but also charm. And this one, what kind of communications do you engage in? I mean, it's one thing to be talking to a small group of your close colleagues. It's another thing to be alone, possibly alone in a foreign country, talking to people who represent, a different viewpoint than you, and maybe English isn't their first language, and there's been some open hostility. I mean, that's a hard thing to do. Heidi, I think more than once you've gone to China and spoken with a delegation of Chinese aluminum officials who probably were not particularly happy with some of the actions that we've taken. I mean, these are skills that, not everybody, it's understandable that some people aren't naturally good at this from day one. It takes practice, it takes time, it takes repetition.
May I ask, how did you influence them in that situation? When people don't like you, or don't like the things that you've done, who you represent, how do you manage that?
They were all very respectful, but I think that they have respect for somebody who shows up and seeks to understand their culture, and so shows an interest in the country. They love to hear stories about personal trips I've taken to China. So it's not just that I've flown over and I'm attending a business meeting, which they value because it doesn't happen very often. But they also, I know for them, I think something that would mean a lot from the relationship building standpoint is if I took my family and I traveled there as well. So, we have not come to agreement on some very big issues, but I think that for me, it's been starting with, can I show respect for their culture, make sure they know that the issues where we disagree are not personal issues, they're not people versus people, might be a market issue, an investment issue. How can we depersonalize it so that it doesn't feel like it's us against them? Yeah.
And if I can speak on her behalf, I also think that we're very aware that in any negotiation, both sides need to feel like they've won something or accomplished something. So I think we've been really, as an association, we've been very cognizant about trying to find a way where they can appear to claim a victory also. So, for example, one big problem in China is the pollution and the air quality. And these facilities that we would like for them to close down because they have this abundance of excess capacity are pretty bad polluters. And so we know that there's a big drive by the federal government and some of these provinces to clean up the air. And so this would allow them to have a very good story to say we are participating in this big effort for the health of our citizens and for the sustainability of our country. Meanwhile, of course, it helps us a lot too because it gets all this extra capacity out of the market, but they don't want to, no one wants to admit defeat, but if you can claim a victory, that's another way that you can try to persuade them a little bit. In all of the different shifts that we talk about, I always want to talk a little bit about, a particular little leadership module. And I thought for warrior to diplomat, a really good one would be, a very timely one would be negotiations. I suspect you guys have taken negotiations in organizational behavior or one of these other business school classes.
I mean, negotiations is a standalone class.
It's a standalone class. Have you taken it?
No.
No.
It's offered like once a year.
Oh, okay. Well, I shrunk it down because I figured you'd already had some of it, and I didn't think,
A little bit of it in some other classes we did something like a communications class
Okay.
also.
Well, if you take the class, you'll probably go through the very academic exercise, the Harvard business cases of, the first thing they'll tell you is you have to figure out your BATNA. Have you guys ever heard of the term BATNA? It stands for
Something that
Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. So in other words, what's your plan B? If you go into negotiation and plan A doesn't work, what's your plan B? I want to buy this piece of machinery from this supplier, but he's charging me too high of a price, so I'm going to go in there and I'm going to try to get a really low price. And if I know I have another offer from a different vendor, if this doesn't work, I know that's my plan B. And if you get to a certain level and they can't make a deal, then you've got an option. If you have no plan B, then at some point you're in trouble. You just got to take the price. But so you learn about BATNAs, you learn about I think they have terms like ZOPA, Zone of Potential Agreements. Anyway, I don't like to be that academic about negotiation, but one thing which I really recommend is there was a book, or it was a series of essays written back in the 1700s by a French diplomat, and a professor in modern times condensed it into a book, and it's called On the Manner of Negotiating with Princes. And there's a lot of advice and a lot of little insights which even close to 300 years ago still hold up today. So I wanted to bring in a couple of them because I think this holds true for business today and for this subject. The first thing he says is negotiate continually. And what he means by that, he says, the necessity of continual negotiation is to foster ongoing and open communication. A relationship implies a connection characterized by cooperation and trust. And so, maybe the word shouldn't be negotiate continually, but it should be communicate continually or speak continually. I think if you take this on a more micro level, if your boss calls you into their office for a performance review, and it's one of these once a year formal reviews, everyone's a little bit on guard, right? But if your boss engages in repeated casual feedback, it becomes a lot more insightful and a lot more comfortable. And so I think the point here is that, if you're engaging in external stakeholders, if you're dealing with government officials, if you're dealing with competitors, if you're dealing with stakeholders, if you have very infrequent communications, it's harder to break through and have this deeper relationship. So his advice, and I agree with it, is to communicate continually. The second one is seek to harmonize interests. And he goes on to say, the secret of negotiations is to harmonize the interest of the parties involved. The more often a negotiator puts himself in the position of others, the more subtle and effective his arguments will be. So, this starts to bring in that concept of put yourself in their shoes. Try to see the world through their lens. The more you get to know what they're interested in, the better you can negotiate on your side because you know their value system. I think that was a little bit highlighted in the case. Eric grew up and was a taxi administrator or representative in this very Zulu district, he was saying, and he said most Zulu, if you're not a Zulu, then you're kind of out. But he said that he spent so much time there, and they really got to know him. They actually even referred to him as half Zulu, I think he says in the case. I think this is a good example of how, he got to understand, a group that was different from his, and it allowed him to gain trust, and that's what this French envoy said many hundred years ago. This one's kind of funny because I don't think we have a lot of clockmakers anymore, but he says, have the patience of a clockmaker. So let's just say, have patience. And what he says is a diplomat must labor to remove the difficulty or all events to circumvent its results with a patience which no trial can break down. And if you take negotiations, the class, what they'll tell you is that time can be your ally or it can be your enemy. And I think I think a lot of scholars and academics and experts would say that the U.S. is actually really bad at this. We live in a world, in a society where time is money. So anytime the U.S. Government gets involved in a negotiation, we want it to be quick, and we want it to be fast, and so then time becomes our enemy. That other groups and other parties and other countries have learned that if they can slow things down, we tend to get frustrated. We tend to get antsy and want to go ahead and just come to a conclusion. Sometimes the media picks up on it, and if it's something politically unpopular, the media starts to weigh in negatively. And so this advice is to understand that this might go on a long time, and that to negotiate the best settlement, don't let time become your enemy. I think there's famous stories about the Vietnam War and the negotiations of the Vietnam War. They started out renting hotels because they thought this would be kind of fast, and then they realized that this was going to take a long time, so they had to move into houses. And that I think they spent the first month just negotiating what the design of the table would be that they would sit at. We wanted a round table, and they wanted a triangular table, and our people wanted to sit in certain spots, and the Vietnamese wanted different spots. And I don't think they truly cared about this, but it was just a tactic for them to just slow everything down. They knew the war was politically unpopular. They knew the 1968, all the different activism and protests, and Columbia students occupying buildings, and the media. So that was just a classic example of how in a negotiation they use time against us. He says, saturate your mind. Study hard, explore virtually every dimension, and avoid the temptation to, let's hear what they have to say, and then we'll decide how to decide. This is just do your homework, right? Don't. The more information you have, the better analytics you have, then the better you are going to get a good outcome. That if you go in a little bit unprepared, you might end up bringing a knife to a gunfight. So this says really do your homework. And I think this is the last one. Be an apt listener. One of the most necessary qualities in a good negotiator is to be an apt listener, and I'd say that's a good skill for a leader. A leader needs to be a really good listener, and I think number one, it just gives you that appearance of being empathetic and wanting to truly find a common solution that all sides can be happy with. And I also think it could be a big advantage that it could give you the ability to detect something. Sometimes small little offhanded comments can spark something, and you could say, no, wait a minute, you just said something interesting there. Are you saying that you're willing to pay a higher price as long as your service level is better? It just allows you to build on conversation and dialogue. So be a good listener. Is that the last one? Oh, and show respect. And I think this goes well with what Heidi was saying. Respect and deference are fundamental norms of diplomacy. It places the other party at the same, I have a typo there, but it places the party at the same level. So, in any negotiation, there's usually a power dynamic. somebody has more power in that relationship than the other. And so, if you're that powerful side, it could be tempting to diminish or to dismiss the other party. But if you do that, then you are probably hurting yourself, because then it's putting them on guard. And if you show them proper deference and proper respect, then it allows two sides to talk on equal footing. So it's amazing that these were parables discussed a long time ago, but I still think today they're useful. So if you ever have a time, Francois de, you can look that up on Amazon. But it's interesting stuff. Okay, but this class, we're talking about the shift, right? That's the whole point of this class, is that shift. So, what are the challenges to this transition, moving from warrior to diplomat? I just listed a couple. Number one, you could be unexperienced in persuasion techniques. I think in our last class, Julian, we talked a little bit about influence, and we saw a video that showed that a waiter or waitress that gives you 1 mint on when you get your bill, they tend to get a bigger tip than someone who gave no mints. And if you gave 2 mints, you got an even bigger tip than the person who gave you 1 mint. And it's all these sort of strange things where you just say, that can't be possible. But they've done a number of studies, a number of tests, and they've proven that there are legitimate techniques to influencing and persuading people to what you're trying to achieve. So that could be one thing. You're just not very well experienced with persuasion. Number 2, and a big one, lack of public speaking skills. I mean, that's really important, especially as you get up to this enterprise leader and you're the president or CEO. You're going to have to stand in front of a lot of groups and speak. It could be, again, something kind of small like this. You're having an internal town hall meeting of a department, or it could be you're on stage at a conference and you have 200 people in the audience. Or you could be on CNBC or CNN being interviewed. And so you really have to develop that muscle. And along with that, no formal media training. That's one of the first things that, at least in our company, that when you get to a certain level, you have to go through media training. Of course, I think they're a little bit more worried that, let's say you're a plant manager and there's an explosion or an incident at your plant. The first thing that happens is the local camera crew comes to your plant and they want to talk to somebody. And if you stand in front of them and say, well, I don't know what happened, Charlie lost a leg in there, So a lot of that is just more public relations. But as someone who's spent a little bit of time in front of a camera, it helps a lot to go through a training. It's not a natural instinct to look into the camera and not look away and not blink. It's not natural to cut out the ums and the hms. So, Heidi, I'm sure you went through a formal media training at some point.
Multiple times. Yeah. No, I think it's important to repeat it regularly.
And I think it's just repetition. Yeah. You really just have to do it and get better at it. And then, again, lack of soft skills. A lot of, the art of the deal and the art of the negotiation and being a diplomat is knowing how to deal with people, knowing how to talk to people, how to relate to them, how to connect with them, how to persuade and influence them. And as we've discussed in this class, that's a pretty universal theme, is that to be effective, you need to have good soft skills. But to me, these are some of the challenges to this transition. So, having said that, can anybody offer some suggestions on things they can do to improve this, or to help this, or to get better at this? We talked about one, get yourself some formal media training. That's something that's pretty easily available.
Being open-minded to learning, it's kind of what you learned a lot about the Chinese culture and the business environment, and being open-minded to understanding what what got you where you are might not necessarily work now that you're there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Learn new techniques to, yes, learn being open-minded.
Or
whatever else.
Or trying to see their perspective.
Right.
You go to China, you bring your family, you travel around, you talk to people, you learn a little bit about them, and are they a proud people? Are they, are they a precision culture? Are they a little bit more, loose? You learn a lot, but just by being visible and talking to people.
Also finding like safe places to actually get out there and try it. Whether or not it's like a volunteer organization, but like you're not going to get soft skills unless you get out there and try them. No matter how many books or things you read or classes you take, it's really an experience thing.
I think we would call that a pilot program. A low risk endeavor. If you fail at your church or in your poker game, no big deal. You fail on stage in front of 300 people, it feels a little worse.
Yeah, and volunteer organizations too, like influence is so much more important because there's not a lot of that authority structure. So trying to get other people to do things, there's a lot of persuasions, there's a lot of soft skills, a lot of relationship building.
Yep, absolutely. So I think there are a lot of books on persuasion techniques. I mean, this is the kind of the guy, Robert Cialdini. He wrote I think books called The Power of Persuasion. I think he calls it. This one he calls Yes. And these are good. And these are good reads too. I mean, as much as a business book is kind of a fun read, this type of read, you guys will find interesting because it talks about all these tactics that you've probably experienced yourself. The classic one is like the used car salesman tactics. When you read that, you kind of go, oh man, that's happened to me. Like, damn it, I wish I had read this. I could have fought it off better. Yeah, practicing. Just practice public speaking. Try to get as much of it as you can. Of course, a lot of it's on the job. Just opportunities. But as we said, get involved with other things. Get some public speaking. This is for Alex. Again, being visible and being inclusive. This is walking in other people's shoes, even within your own company. I mean, you need to be a diplomat within your own company. You've got different divisions. You've got operations and sales and finance and commercial and HR. And in order to really get everyone's perspective, you got to be out there. You got to be around. You got to talk to people. You got to gather information. That allows you to be the diplomat because you can see through everyone's lenses. A big one, just get external help. All of this stuff is available. You just got to pay for it. But honestly, one time, somebody, when I was in business school, a professor gave the class a really good piece of advice. He said, if you ever get in a position where you have to submit a memo to your company, you've been put on a project, you're the project leader, and at the end of the day you have to deliver a 10-page executive summary and supporting packet to the CEO. He said, if you're not a good writer, he said, find someone who is. Hire someone, pay someone $150 to just proofread, clean up all your punctuation errors, get rid of all your run-on what do you call those things? Dangling participles. For $150 or whatever it costs to submit something which is professional and well done. Why would you not spend that money? But that doesn't normally occur to us, right? But why not? Get external help. You've probably heard me say this before. I really think you guys, you guys be careful. I might bring in an improv person into this class before this class is over. I really recommend you guys take an improv class. It is so helpful for listening, for building off what people say, for public speaking, for for being willing to be vulnerable. It was one of the best things that I ever did, taking an improv class. And it's fun. If you can do it with friends, it's great. But I really think there's an art to it, and there's some skills behind it, and those skills really translate quite well to leadership and to being in front of people and listening and being a thoughtful leader. Yeah, and this one, improve your listening. I mean, again, this is something you can't say enough. But in order to be a diplomat, in order to try to find these winning solutions, to build these networks, to find these opportunities, you have to be willing to listen. And and I can tell you that it's a pretty rare skill. I mean, in the video we talked about people who have this competitive drive. People who tend to have competitive drives tend to not be great listeners. They tend to be head down, charging forward so fast that the wind's going past their ears and they just can't hear anything. And so, I find the most effective diplomats tend to be really good listeners. Okay, it's 7:15. It's been about an hour. Let's take a 10-minute break. Let's come back at 7:25.